What happens when America's most renowned television psychologist steps onto a talk show that has spent years diagnosing a political figure from afar? Armed with clinical definitions and a commitment to truth, he holds up a mirror that no one asked for. When a trained expert in human behavior encounters hosts whose actions speak louder than words, and a question meant to seek professional validation for pre-existing political hatred backfires spectacularly because the expert refuses to play along with armchair psychology. What you're about to witness isn't just another political debate or partisan argument. It's the moment Dr. Phil, a man who has spent decades actually treating patients instead of diagnosing public figures from TV studios, reminded everyone that psychology is a science, not a political tool. This is Joy Behar realizing that inviting a true expert onto her show can backfire when that expert has integrity. This is what happens when someone seeks professional validation but ends up getting an education instead. Dr. Phil entered The View that day knowing exactly what they wanted from him. Professional endorsement of their political stance, expert validation that their target was mentally ill, ammunition to justify their pre-existing contempt. What he gave them instead was a masterclass on how real psychology works. He held a mirror to their behavior and reminded everyone that a clinical diagnosis requires more than just watching someone on television and deciding you don't like them. Joy Behar thought she was setting up a softball question to let Dr. Phil confirm everything The View had been saying for years. But instead she was schooled on the difference between psychology and political theater, between clinical diagnosis and partisan hatred. And the moment she realized what was happening, that priceless moment when the trap she set for Dr. Phil caught her instead, was worth every second. Buckle up, because what unfolds isn't just good television. It's a lesson in how real expertise stands firm when it refuses to be weaponized for political purposes, in how science operates with integrity despite pressure to compromise, and what happens when someone finally calls out the armchair diagnosticians who have been playing doctor for ratings. The studio hummed with its usual energy. That morning, the hosts settled into their seats, exuding the confidence of people who had performed this routine countless times. The topic had been chosen in advance, the narrative planned out, and the questions choreographed to give the audience exactly what they expected. Political commentary wrapped in the guise of concern, partisan attacks disguised as legitimate questions. Dr. Phil sat across from them with the relaxed authority of someone who had been in front of cameras for decades, who had navigated countless interviews, and who understood media dynamics but wasn't controlled by them. He carried himself with that unique combination of Southern charm and professional expertise that had made him a household name. Approachable yet authoritative, friendly but not easily manipulated. The conversation flowed smoothly at first, touching on various topics, building toward the moment Joy had been preparing for all morning. She had done her research, crafted her question, and set up what she thought was an airtight scenario that would let Dr. Phil confirm everything The View had been saying about their favorite political target. This was supposed to be validation, a professional endorsement of positions they had already committed to. But Joy made a fundamental miscalculation. She had assumed Dr. Phil would prioritize being a good guest over being a good psychologist. She had forgotten that some people value professional integrity more than television appearances or audience approval. She was about to learn this lesson the hard way. "Well, counselor, doctor," Joy began, her voice carrying the tone of someone who thinks they're being clever. "You can't diagnose anyone from afar. Someone you haven't examined. Doctors, therapists, but a lot of respected psychologists out there, really big-time names, are saying that Donald Trump is showing signs of narcissism." She paused for effect, clearly thinking she'd framed the question perfectly. One of the symptoms is being preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power, success, and brilliance. They're questioning whether he has narcissistic personality disorder. So, number one, do you think that's a mental illness, narcissism? And if so, is he fit to be president? The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions, and clearly designed to force a particular answer. But Dr. Phil, having been in the game for too long, wasn't about to fall into such an obvious trap. "Well, counselor, doctor," he said, his voice dripping with amusement at the transparent setup. "That's a compound question, and I object." The audience laughed, but Dr. Phil wasn't joking. He was already establishing that he wouldn't be manipulated into answering loaded questions meant to generate a predetermined conclusion. He was a psychologist, not a political operative. And he was about to show everyone the difference. You know, people talk about narcissism, Dr. Phil continued, pulling out actual notes. But they don't really know what it means. So, I brought a list from the DSM-5 about what narcissism really is. Because if I asked people to stand up and define it, they wouldn't know. This was already straying off script. Joy had expected validation, not a lesson. She wanted Dr. Phil to confirm that the political figure they despised was mentally ill. Instead, he was preparing to give an actual psychology lesson, complete with clinical definitions from the diagnostic manual that professionals use. Let's just take a look. Dr. Phil began reading from his notes. 1. Has a grandiose sense of self-importance. Before he could continue, Joy eagerly jumped in. Check. 2. Is preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, or brilliance, which you said. Check, she repeated, clearly delighted that Dr. Phil seemed to be confirming her diagnosis. 3. Believes that he or she is special or unique and can only be understood by special people. Check. Joy's voice now carried a triumphant tone, as if each item on the list was proving her point rather than building towards something else entirely. 4. Requires excessive admiration. Oh, check, she exclaimed, almost giddy. Convinced everything was going exactly as she planned, Dr. Phil continued to read through the diagnostic criteria, his voice steady and clinical, letting Joy eagerly confirm each point. Has a sense of entitlement, meaning is very thin-skinned if criticized. Is interpersonally exploitative. Lacks empathy. Has the inability to stand in other people's shoes and understand. Like when he makes fun of people who are handicapped, Joy couldn't resist adding her interpretation. I'm just reading it, Dr. Phil said calmly. A subtle warning that she was editorializing rather than listening. You interpret it however you want. Is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her. Shows arrogant and haughty behaviors. Dr. Phil continued, looking up from his notes with a knowing expression. How many people does that describe? Joy, still unaware of the trap she had walked into, answered. That's a lot of people. And then Dr. Phil delivered the line that would become the defining moment of the entire interview. One that would be replayed thousands of times across social media. A statement that perfectly captured what had just transpired. Well, that is a lot of people, he said, his voice carrying unmistakable meaning. And if you take out everybody who has any of those characteristics, then you're going to take out a lot of people, including some at this table. The silence that followed was deafening. The camera captured Joy's face in that moment, her expression going through a visible transformation. Confusion, recognition, and barely controlled anger flashed across her features in a matter of seconds. Dr. Phil had just done something extraordinary. He took Joy's attempt to use psychology as a political weapon and turned it into an actual psychological assessment, not of the political figure they wanted to attack, but of the very people doing the attacking. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The audience, which had been eagerly following Joy's enthusiastic checks, suddenly went silent as the full implications sank in. This wasn't the validation session they had anticipated. It was a psychology professor catching his students in their own hypocrisy. Joy tried to recover, her voice rising in defensive indignation. Things that we go through, you wouldn't look at President Obama and say he has narcissistic disorder. So, you can't just say they all have it. But Dr. Phil wasn't backing down. People have all the things you said. We just checked every one of them. He paused. I said most leaders are under a lot of stress and pressure. So a lot of them will show anxiety, depression at different times. A lot of leaders will have some affliction at different times because of the pressure and demands of the office. The brilliance of his response was multi-layered. First, he refused to weaponize psychology for political purposes. He wouldn't diagnose anyone he hadn't personally examined, regardless of political affiliation. Second, he pointed out that many personality traits exist on a spectrum, and what might look like narcissism from a distance could actually be normal leadership confidence, ego, or the psychological armor people develop to handle extraordinary pressure. Third, and most devastatingly, he used Joy's eagerness to apply these labels to demonstrate that she herself possessed many of the same characteristics she was so quick to identify in others. The irony in the moment was thick enough to cut with a knife. Here was a show that had spent years diagnosing a political figure from afar, bringing on countless experts to validate their armchair psychology, weaponizing mental health terminology for political attacks. Yet the one time they brought someone with actual expertise and professional ethics onto the show, that expert turned their weapon back on them. Joy Becker's face went through several shades of red, her body language radiating discomfort even as she tried to maintain her composure. She had expected an ally who would confirm her biases. Instead, she got a professional who exposed those biases for what they were: political hatred dressed up in psychological language. Partisan attacks wrapped in the legitimacy of clinical terminology. The confrontation revealed a profound truth about the difference between actual expertise and television expertise. Dr. Phil could have easily played along, given Joy the sound bites she wanted, used his credentials to validate whatever position would make him popular with the audience and hosts. Many TV experts do just that. They understand their role is to provide professional-sounding confirmation of whatever narrative the show is pushing. But Dr. Phil had built his career on something far more substantial than television popularity. He had actually treated patients, studied psychology at the highest levels, and maintained professional ethics, even when those ethics became inconvenient for his entertainment career. In that moment, Dr. Phil had a choice: be a good guest or be a good psychologist. He chose his professional integrity. The implications of his decision extended far beyond one interview or one political figure. He had demonstrated what real psychological assessment looks like versus the partisan performance that had been masquerading as a mental health concern. Real psychology requires examination, context, and understanding the full picture, rather than cherry-picking behaviors that confirm pre-existing judgments. More importantly, Dr. Phil had exposed the dangerous game of armchair diagnosis that had become so prevalent in political discourse. When you start deciding that political opponents must be mentally ill, when you weaponize clinical terminology for partisan purposes, when you use the language of psychology to delegitimize people you simply disagree with, you are not practicing psychology. You are doing politics with a medical veneer. By calmly pointing out that Joy herself exhibited many of the characteristics she was eager to diagnose in others, Dr. Phil revealed the fundamental projection at work. People who spend their days analyzing others' narcissism rarely stop to examine their own. Those quickest to throw around clinical diagnoses of their enemies rarely apply those same standards to themselves. The audience, initially eager to hear professional confirmation of their political views, had just witnessed something unexpected: an actual lesson in psychology that challenged rather than confirmed their assumptions. Some looked thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering how quickly they'd adopted armchair diagnosis. Others were defensive, uncomfortable with having their certainty challenged. But Joy, she looked angry. Genuine frustration, not the performative anger she often deployed on the show for effect. She had brought Dr. Phil on specifically to get ammunition for her political attacks, and instead he had used his expertise to reflect her own behavior back at her. The rest of the segment was awkward, filled with attempts to redirect the conversation, but it never quite regained its energy or purpose. Dr. Phil had done something rare in modern television. He had refused to let his expertise be weaponized, maintained professional ethics despite pressure to abandon them, and demonstrated that some people still value truth over tribal allegiance. As the interview ended and Dr. Phil left the set, the hosts tried to process what had just happened, to make sense of a guest who had refused to validate their narrative. But their analysis missed the point entirely. They were still operating within the framework that Dr. Phil had rejected: the idea that psychology could and should be used as a political weapon. In the aftermath, as clips of the exchange spread across social media, reactions split along predictable lines. Those who shared Joy's political views accused Dr. Phil of being partisan himself, of defending someone who clearly exhibited problematic behavior. Those who opposed Joy's politics celebrated Dr. Phil for exposing the hypocrisy and projections so evident in her questioning. However, the more thoughtful responses came from mental health professionals who recognized what Dr. Phil had truly done. He had defended the integrity of their field against those who would reduce it to political theater. He reminded everyone that clinical diagnosis is serious business that requires training, examination, and professional ethics, not television appearances or political hatred. This is why the Goldwater Rule exists, one psychologist noted, referring to the American Psychiatric Association's ethical guideline against diagnosing public figures you haven't personally examined. Dr. Phil just demonstrated why it's so important. One observer noted, "When you start diagnosing from afar based on behavior you don't like, you're not doing psychology, you're doing politics." Another observation captured the deeper significance. Watch Joy's face when Dr. Phil says, "including some at this table." That's the moment she realizes she's been describing herself. That's what projection looks like when it gets called out. The brilliance of Dr. Phil's approach lay in its simplicity. He didn't refuse to discuss narcissism or claim it wasn't a real condition. He didn't defend or attack any specific political figure. Instead, he laid out the actual clinical criteria. He let Joy eagerly check off those criteria as they described someone she hated, and then calmly pointed out that the same criteria described a lot of people, including some sitting right there in the studio. By refusing to play the game Joy wanted him to play, by maintaining his professional integrity instead of becoming another political operative with credentials, Dr. Phil did something increasingly rare in modern media. He valued truth over team loyalty, substance over spectacle, professional ethics over entertainment value. Joy Behar had invited an expert onto her show, expecting validation. What she got instead was education, mirror holding, and a reminder that expertise means something beyond simply having the credentials to say what people want to hear. Real experts maintain standards, even when those standards become inconvenient. Real professionals refuse to weaponize their fields for political purposes. Real integrity looks like choosing to be right over choosing to be popular. The broader lesson extended far beyond the view, one political figure, or even psychology itself. In a culture where expertise is increasingly weaponized for partisan purposes, where credentials are often used to provide professional-sounding confirmation of political positions rather than actual expertise, Dr. Phil demonstrated what integrity looks like when it refuses to be compromised. He showed that you could disagree with someone politically without diagnosing them with mental illness. You could recognize problematic behavior without reducing it to clinical pathology. You could maintain your professional standards even when pressure and opportunity align to suggest abandoning them. Most importantly, Dr. Phil revealed the dangerous narcissism, not the political diagnosis, of people who spend their days analyzing others without ever examining themselves. The eagerness with which Joy checked off every narcissism symptom when applied to someone she hated, combined with her complete blindness to those same symptoms in herself, perfectly illustrated the projection and lack of self-awareness that characterize actual narcissistic behavior. The View moved on to its next segment, next guest, next controversy. The news cycle continued. But for those who'd witnessed that moment, something important had been demonstrated. That expertise still matters when exercised with integrity. That professional standards still exist, even when culture pressures people to abandon them. And that sometimes the most powerful thing an expert can do is refuse to let their expertise be weaponized for purposes it was never intended to serve. Dr. Phil left that studio exactly as he entered it, professionally credible, ethically grounded, unwilling to compromise his standards for anyone's convenience. He hadn't won any political points or gained any partisan allies. What he'd done was far more valuable. He defended the integrity of his field, reminded everyone that clinical psychology is a science, not a political weapon, and demonstrated that some people still value being right over being popular. Joy Behar had tried to use psychology to attack her political opponents. Dr. Phil had used psychology to reveal her own behavior. And in that simple reversal, in that moment when the mirror was turned around, everyone watching learned something about projection, about narcissism, and about what happens when you invite a real expert expecting validation and get education instead.